Hi everyone, welcome to my final presentation on the preservation of quilts. Quilting is a method of stitching layers of material together. There are different patterns that can be designed as well as different stitching techniques. Usually there are three parts, which are the top fabric layer, the middle batting or cushioned layer, and the fabric layer at the bottom. Below, at the bottom of the slide, there is a link to a more detailed explanation of how quilts are made if you're interested. Historically, quilts were used for bed covers as well as clothing. For example, in the medieval era, quilting techniques were used to create light and warm clothing. It was also used for armor, where padding could be put into the armor to make it more comfortable, or in some cases, quilted clothing could be used as a top layer for those who could not afford metal armor. This is an example of a medieval quilt from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London of a very early medieval quilt. And this is an example of an article of clothing made using quilting techniques, also from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Some of the inherent difficulties with the medium of quilting is that the fabric becomes delicate and very vulnerable with age. It is also susceptible to snagging, staining, and creasing. There are also environmental factors such as light, humidity, and moisture, as well as temperature control and insects that can all be contributing to the issues of preserving quilts. The size and weight of quilts make them very challenging to preserve as well as to display in exhibitions. In the images on the left, you can see a torn quilt, and in the image on the right, if you look carefully, that discoloration is actually evidence of mold. Here are the best storage and handling practices to preserve quilts. Wear protective cotton gloves and handle with two hands to best support the quilt, and the gloves are used to prevent skin oils, lotions, or perfume from harming the delicate material. Use supports as necessary if two hands is not enough to handle the material. Delicate quilts often cannot bear their own weight, especially as they get aged with time. It's important to remove jewelry. This prevents your jewelry from getting caught on the material and creating snags or tears that can become more problematic and larger over time. Lay a quilt flat on a clean, dry surface. It's important to not eat or drink when handling the quilt or in the near vicinity to avoid food stains, which can be difficult to get out. Store quilts with other quilts and textiles. Do not store with papers, photographs, jewelry, or other items of memorabilia. This is important because these items can often transfer stains. For example, if it's jewelry, it can leave a rust stain, or if it's paper, it can leave an ink stain. Many people believe that storing textiles and quilts in wooden or cedar boxes is the best option, but actually this is not ideal, as over time the wood can leave stains on the materials, so wooden boxes are not necessarily the best choice. As far as temperature goes, a comfortable temperature for people is what's best suited for textiles. The ideal storage container for quilts is a textile storage box, which can be seen in the image along with gloves and acid-free tissue paper. This offers an acid-free, compact, self-contained environment that will protect the quilt from dust, moisture, household contaminants, insects, and other harmful things. It's a good option to use archival tissue paper, which can be folded between the layers of the quilt. This adds an extra layer of protection by helping support the quilt and reduces creasing. There are two types of archival storage paper, which are buffered and unbuffered. Buffered tissue contains buffering agents that will help neutralize any acids, while unbuffered tissue does not contain this agent. If you're unsure of what to use, depending on what the quilt is made of, it's best to just use unbuffered. It's important to refold the quilt a few times a year to avoid permanent creasing. The International Quilt Museum actually recommends that they refold their quilts every 2 years to avoid damage, and to consciously fold along different lines each time. Then they layer tissue paper on the top of the quilt and support the last folds with rolls of tissue paper to kind of smooth them out. They also explain that they store most quilts in archival boxes, but some are stored flat in drawers or rolled around acid-free tubes. Ideally, quilts are stored flat, but when this is not possible, store them with as few folds as possible, or more preferably wrapped around an acid-free cardboard tube with a large diameter. Do not stack things on top, or if you absolutely have to, make sure to stack only lightweight objects and make sure there's not too much pressure on the box. Store in a room temperature environment and a dry place, avoiding attics and basement that are often not temperature controlled and are often exposed to moisture. Avoid washing and dry cleaning, as they can lead to dye, color running, or bleeding, and agitation during the cleaning processes can cause structural damage to the quilt. When possible, it is best to leave items in their original state and to avoid mending or repairing. But if this is not possible, there are textile conservators who can be of help. The weight and size of quilts make them very difficult to display, and it is best to limit long-term display due to concerns about light and being extremely damaging sunlight and artificial light. There's an example about how to display best practices from the International Quilt Museum, which is affiliated with the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Their policy is to only display a quilt for a maximum of 1 year out of every 10 years, so that they can minimize the light exposure on the quilt and reduce the wear and tear from hanging the quilt on display. Their museum's policy is to add cotton sleeves that are 100% cotton. They add them to the back of the quilt that is going to be displayed in the exhibition. The sleeves are sewn by hand with large stitches, and the point of the sleeves are to distribute the weight evenly across the width of the quilt, reducing stress to the fibers. Most quilts are hung using a cord suspension system. They slide an adjustable aluminum slat through the quilt sleeves. The slats are attached to nylon cords, which are suspended from a hanging rail on the walls. Quilts are hung so that the center of the quilt falls roughly at eye level, providing an optimal viewing opportunity for the viewer. The next few slides are just a couple of images from the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska, just so you can get a sense of how they're hung. You can kind of look at the picture and kind of see the nylon cords and how they're hung from the wall. In this example, you can actually see some of them are propped on backing boards slightly away from the wall, and some are also laid flat on tables. Also laid flat on tables here as well. Here is discussion question number 1. Imagine you are a museum curator working on an upcoming exhibition. You have a quilt in the collection that has experienced a lot of deterioration due to age and the delicate nature of the fabric. Including it in an extended museum display risks the long-term preservation of the quilt. However, the donors who contributed to the funding for the exhibition have insisted that it be included, as they feel it is a core part of the display and want it to hang on the wall as a focal point of the exhibition. What do you do as the curator? Do you display the vulnerable item, or is there another solution you pursue? How do you handle this situation, and what steps do you take? Question number 2. Quilts are often family heirlooms handmade by loved ones and filled with sentimental and personal value, as well as historical significance in many cases. This leads to quilts bringing to mind ideas of being cozy and comfortable, and they are often affiliated with feelings of restfulness and hominess. Take a moment to think about the medium and physicality of quilting and the significance that that physicality has for issues such as social memory, cultural identity, and community connection. How important is the role of physical contact or touch when it comes to quilts? Do you think some of the significance or power of that medium is lost when a quilt is hung on a museum wall and no longer able to provide that comfortability via touch? Why or why not? If so, can you think of any creative ways to combat this loss of physical connection?